Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of ENO webinars. ENO is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that shapes public debate on critical multimodal transportation issues and builds a robust network of transportation professionals. My name is Katie Donahue, and I'm a policy analyst at ENO. Today, we're discussing personal delivery devices' evolving characteristics, their rapidly changing regulatory environment, as well as new challenges facing their deployment. Joining us is Dr. Michael Clamann, the Senior Human Factors Engineer at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, where he researches human automation interaction and autonomous technologies. Just a bit of housekeeping. At any point during Dr. Clamann's presentation, you can submit questions using the questions function on the right panel of your webinar screen. You can also submit questions after the presentation is finished, and we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A portion. While we don't expect any tech issues, we do find that if you're having trouble, exiting and rejoining the webinar tends to solve any minor issues. ENO is happy to offer our webinar series free of charge. And if you do enjoy our webinars and are interested in supporting our work, you can check the link in the chat box to donate or become a member. After this live presentation, you can find a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the slides on ENO's website, which is enotrans.org. The recording will also be emailed to all registrants within one day. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Clamann.
Okay. Thank you, Katie, and thank you to the ENO Center for Transportation for the opportunity to share our research. We really appreciate it. Just a quick note on this one. The project that I'm going to be talking about, which is summarized in an information brief that we just released last month, was done with the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, with the help from my co-author, Meg Bryson. It was funded by FHWA, but the views that are expressed in this particular webinar are mine. So this research project that we worked on had a number of different goals, and what I'm going to talk about today is in support of those. So what I'm going to do is introduce personal delivery devices with an emphasis on the effect on pedestrians. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the technology itself, where they operate, but I'm going to devote most of the discussion to how state policy is addressing the technology. Now, this has only been around for about 4 years now, so it's a very short history. The first law at personal delivery devices was submitted in 2017. But if you follow policy issues with technology, you know that generally policy does struggle to keep up with emerging technology, and we'll find that personal delivery devices are no exception to that particular rule. So. With that, I want to give one quick note about my background so you can understand kind of the perspective that I'm coming from when I discuss personal delivery devices. As Katie mentioned, I'm a human factors engineer by training and education, and my research is in human automation interaction. So what that means, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, I study how to make automated tools both safer and more effective around their human operators. So in the past, I've worked on military systems, I've worked with drones, I've worked in aerospace, and I also do research on automated vehicles, especially how they interact with people outside the vehicle, so pedestrians and bicyclists. But a lot of these systems share a few things in common with personal delivery devices, such as how we communicate with them and how they communicate back with us. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here today comes from that previous experience with automated systems. Okay, so to get started, what is it we're actually talking about here? So there's a few terms that have been used to describe these devices: sideway delivery robots, sidewalk robots, autonomous delivery vehicles. But I'm going to use the term personal delivery device because that's what's used in state legislation. So the definition that we have here is that it's an electronically powered device for transporting cargo that's equipped with an automated driving technology that enables the operation of the device with or without the remote supervision of a human being. So they are intended primarily to transport on sidewalks and crosswalks, so places where pedestrians work. They're fairly similar in technology to automated vehicles. So if you're familiar with those sensor suites, uses cameras, LiDAR, sometimes radar for sensing objects in the environment, and then also for using global positioning devices and inertial measurement units for navigating the immediate area. For the time being, they generally require some degree of remote communication with an operator who's off-site. but there's never a person inside the vehicle. So there's no driver, there's no passenger, there's only cargo. So because of that reason, they're not considered vehicles by most states. So a couple of examples that are some of the more common examples. Here you have a couple robots by Starship and by Amazon, and these are two that were some of the driving forces behind some of the early legislation about 4 years ago. And these are also probably two of the best known that are out there. So these are smaller, slow-moving sidewalk robots. They're less than 4 feet tall. They weigh less than 100 pounds unloaded, and they typically operate on sidewalks and in different pedestrian spaces at fairly slow speed, so between 1 and 3.5 miles an hour. This is the majority of the PDDs that are currently in use. They're used generally for ordering takeout and delivering small packages. All right, another fairly common one, and again, this is another one that is one of the driving forces behind current legislation, is the Roxo by FedEx. This is a larger, heavier sidewalk robot. They're typically around 4 feet tall. They weigh more than 100 pounds, but they also, like the other ones, they operate on sidewalks and at pedestrian speeds are higher, so limited to about 10 miles an hour. These, of course, can carry larger and heavier loads than their counterparts by Amazon and Starship. So these are some of the more common ones and some of the ones that you'll see referred to in the legislation, but there's also a few other designs that are worth at least keeping in mind. So one of them, just worth mentioning, is the Rev1 by Refraction. This is a faster moving robot that's designed to operate in bike lanes. It's going to travel at speeds that are higher than pedestrian speeds, so say between 10 and 20 miles an hour, but it's intended to behave a bit more like a bicycle. So it's going to be traveling on the bike lane or far to the shoulder on a roadway. So the idea behind this one is that it can travel faster and farther, so it has a wider delivery area. All right, and then another one is the Ford Digit, and this, as you can probably tell, this is a robot without wheels. It also operates on sidewalks around pedestrian speeds, and the idea behind this one is that they can handle terrain that might be more challenging for a wheeled robot. The last example that I'm going to mention is the Neuro R2, which you all may also be familiar with from previous ENO presentations. This is a large roving kiosk that delivers its wares on roadways. So because it operates on the roads, it's not actually a PDD. So this is on the other side of the spectrum. So this one actually requires an exemption from NHTSA, and this is not the kind of thing that I'm going to be talking about. So it's more the other, like, smaller devices that operate on sidewalks. Okay, so from those examples, you can see that there's a few different types of designs, and as the innovation continues, we're going to start to see them reach more and more different types of spaces. But the fundamental idea for all of these devices is that they share spaces with pedestrians and cyclists. So they're designed to be used on sidewalks, on crosswalks, on the shoulders of roads, and as some legislation has put it, as close as possible to the extreme right, so much like a bicycle. They also operate within a limited delivery area, like a college campus or something along those lines. Okay, so here's kind of a schematic of what an area might look like with the sidewalk here. So you can see that there's a few scenarios that a robot might run into. So they might have to interact with multiple transportation modes, say scooters and cyclists and other cars. They might be coming in a number of different directions. They're going to be interacting with people with different characteristics and different traveling goals. So they're going to be encountering children who don't necessarily have the same type of understanding of risk as adults do. You might have people who are distracted by different sorts of things. There's also, in addition to the people, there's also different characteristics of the built environment. So you have wide sidewalks, you have narrow sidewalks. You also have different items, that are built into, assembled into the built environment that may narrow the area and require people or the robots to navigate around them. You've got the curb cuts that go down into the into the bike lanes and into the crossing areas that can be fairly narrow and can be challenging to navigate around. And then all of this becomes more difficult to navigate in any kind of bad weather. All right, but beyond what's depicted here, the devices, the personal delivery devices, will also encounter delivery drivers who are coming up to the curbside, public transit, dropping off at bus stops, bicyclists, and eventually, as time goes on, more and different brands of personal delivery devices that are going to be competing for space on the sidewalk. So basically, as it becomes more dense and there's more individuals using the sidewalk, there's more potential for encounters and raises more questions about how we will cooperate with these robots and how they'll be cooperating with us. So, I mean, certainly different types of conflicts and different sorts of encounters are inevitable. And also, from the perspective of the robots, they're having to take in all this information from what's essentially a dog's eye view, which also just compounds the different challenges that they're going to be running into. Okay, so because they're going to be operating in close proximity, there need to be some type of guardrails in place to maintain public safety. So for right now, there's no federal legislation in place that provides any sort of guidance. So that's where the states have kind of had to step in and come up with their own guidelines for safety. So quick tangent here. When we first set out to work on this project, one of the first things we looked for was some type of central source that was tracking legislative developments for personal delivery devices. And so when we found that there wasn't one out there, we decided to create one. And this is available on the PBIC website currently. And so it comes in, there's two different parts to it. Part one, which is what is here on the screen, just shows the status of the bill itself, when was it submitted, whether or not it was passed, and a link to the text. And then the second part is the actual content of the bill. So the information that I'm going to be presenting, during this particular session does come from the text of different state bills and is available on the website. Okay. All right. So over the past 4 years, since it started in 2017, there have been a total of 32 bills that have been introduced. They've been introduced in 27 different states, and to date, 21 of them have passed. Now, I've got this chart shows the number of bills introduced and have been passed each year since this all started. There's an asterisk by 2021, excuse me, because this chart only reflects July, and there may have been some development since then and could continue to the end of the year. So what's interesting about it is that up until 2020, they were pretty much batting 1,000, and the various states passed everything that was introduced. So we've seen it split off, and not everything has passed that has been introduced since then. Some states at this point, it's been going on long enough that a couple of states have actually introduced multiple bills that make amendments to the laws that they passed in 2017 and 2018. All right, so here are the different states where they've actually passed legislation governing personal delivery devices. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they don't operate elsewhere. So for example, in Georgia and California, they are still doing testing. This is just, where there's some kind of legislation that governs the personal delivery devices. It also doesn't necessarily mean that, that they're operating there. So for example, in my home state of North Carolina, we did pass legislation, but to the best of my knowledge, they're not being tested anywhere. All right, so the content of the legislation itself. So since these things don't actually operate on roads, they're not subject to motor vehicle codes in most states. They're not regulated by departments of transportation, and they're not registered with your local Department of Motor Vehicles. So then that remains what the states can actually regulate. Okay, so this table shows some of the sections that are typically included in state legislation. If you look through a number of different bills, what you start to notice is that they tend to follow a common framework. There's some, and these topics that you see here on this particular table are some of the topics that you see in almost all of the bills that have been submitted. So One of them has to do with the physical characteristics governing speed and weight. So typically they're restricted to between 3.5 and 12 miles per hour on sidewalks and 10 to 20 miles per hour in roads. Now, it's much more common for them to regulate the speed on the sidewalk. You don't see the speed on the roads quite as often. And for the most part, the most common speed that you see as a max speed on a sidewalk is 10 miles per hour. The weight that they provide, there's a wide range there. It's between 80 and 1,000 pounds. And in almost all the cases, the weight that they're listing here is an unloaded weight. So the actual cap on the weight of these devices is unknown, because you could have a 1,000-pound robot carrying a weight that goes well beyond, what the robot weighs itself. Areas of operation I've already mentioned. They typically say sidewalk, crosswalk, shoulders, and similar spaces to those. What I'm referring to in human oversight, that next one, that means what is the type of human supervision that's required? Now, the expectation is at some point these are going to be true robots and that they'll be automated. But for the time being, many of the laws actually mention the requirement for some kind of oversight. So within this section, you see 14 out of the 32 states require some level of active human control. 3 of those states actually require some kind of control within 25 to 30 feet line of sight. So in some of these cases, you do actually have a human monitor that's required to walk or ride or be on a scooter behind these devices, supervising them. Right-of-way, for the most part, tends to describe personal delivery devices in the same terms that pedestrians are described, but they generally are expected to yield right-of-way to pedestrians. A couple of other things that are on there: hazardous materials are generally not allowed. These are not allowed, permitted to carry any sort of hazardous materials. There's one state that does actually allow that right now. They also generally all require some kind of a marker that clearly identifies the name and contact information. So this is a legible placard that's somewhere on the device that gives, say, the name of the company and a phone number to contact the company. And then also they require some kind of liability insurance, and this is usually around $100,000. So when you look at the framework here, you can start to see that safety is more or less in the hands of the companies, not necessarily being maintained by the state legislation. So according to most of the laws, you could imagine these devices buzzing past people at 10 miles per hour, which certainly would not be terribly safe in a pedestrian environment. Now, what the companies would tell you, certainly as expected, when they get into areas where pedestrians are present, they slow down. But again, that's not something you could actually see from the legislation itself, and something that we have to entrust to the companies. So there are, given examples like that, there are a few open questions. So one of the things that you notice, if you look at the submitted bills, so this chart shows the average of the allowable weight limits since 2017. And what you see is in the last couple of years, weights have gone up a great deal. But at the same time, there haven't been any adjustments to speed. So what you're seeing from a physics standpoint is an increasing momentum, and therefore the level of risk that could happen if one of these devices collided with somebody who was on the sidewalk. So this happened basically right around January of 2020. There was a sudden increase in the weight in the maximum weight limit in the bills, and after that date, there has not been a single bill that's been passed where the weight limit was below 500 pounds. So there was a big jump right around 2020. Now, when you look at the world of industrial robots, so robots that operate inside warehouses and things like that, the best way to reduce injury is to reduce the weight. So in industrial locations, we're seeing trends towards making them smaller and a little bit safer. But here on sidewalks, we're seeing a trend, during this kind of design and development phase, we're going in the other direction of actually making them larger and just as fast. Okay, so a couple of other things that might be missing from legislation. So going back to our street scene with a few more actors, kind of points out that we need to consider some of the demographics of the people that we're working with. So there are people who might move slower than the so-called average, the average person. So some like the elderly, senior citizens. Many of these devices also have requirements for lights. So they have to be visible at dusk and at nighttime until about 500 feet. But there aren't really any, save one exception, there's no requirements for any type of audio warnings. So that doesn't really help somebody with a vision impairment or somebody who's distracted. Wheelchairs also need a lot of extra room to maneuver compared to walking pedestrians. So there needs to be additional accommodations on narrow sidewalks for wheelchairs to be able to move past these devices. And it becomes even worse, as I mentioned before, in bad weather, where the curb cuts and the sidewalks become narrower, and then there's even less space to share with people with disabilities. Now, at this stage, this is where it becomes important for both the companies and for legislators to reach out to local communities where these are going to be deployed. Before these are actually, going to be appearing on the sidewalks, it's crucial to talk to community leaders to find out which of these different topics are going to be important, or are significant for these deployments. To date, when you attend any of the discussions when these bills are being discussed, it's really just the technology companies for the most part that are present there. You don't see some of these other, local groups. But there are things that you're not going to see, like the things I've depicted here, unless you actually interact with the local community. And unfortunately, in the past, we've seen a number of missteps with these when you have a technology that's developed in certain wealthy white communities, but then you deploy them and see unexpected behaviors when you release them in communities of color. So again, it's crucial that these actually be tested and discussed in advance in a local community before they're actually deployed. All right, another challenging area has to do with crashes. Unfortunately, as safe, and definitely companies are putting a lot of time into making sure that these devices are as safe as possible. But when you're working, especially at scale with more robots, more people, challenging environments, there are going to be conflicts. And in this section, we can learn from micromobility. And one of the challenges that happen, and is still currently happening with e-scooters, e-bikes, and similar technologies, is that not all states have a method of recording crashes. And so if you can actually record what's happened, then you can learn from those mistakes. So you can write up a crash report that talks about the conditions and the different contributing factors that led to the crash. So then you can go back and look at the aggregated data and find out, what changes you might need to make things safer over time. What's happened, unfortunately, with micromobility is that if you don't report crashes, it doesn't look like have been any crashes. So there also needs to be some kind of a mechanism that transparently shows, how safe they are and what we can do to make them safer over time. Another challenge that happens potentially when they're deployed is how to respond in the event of an actual crash. So imagine that you're the victim of one of these, you trip over it and you dislocate your shoulder or you hurt your hip or something along those lines. What are you supposed to do in that event? I mean, certainly you're going to want to go to the hospital, you're going to want to seek medical attention, but it almost seems like the expectation is that you do something with that number that's on the side of the robot. And I think most people in a crisis situation like that are not necessarily going to start looking at the robot to find the number to call. They're going to want to seek medical attention first. But again, without any type of training, we don't know exactly, what to do in the event of one of these accidents, other than just, go to the hospital or seek attention. If you call 911 and an officer arrives, unless there's been some kind of training or some kind of formal method of crash reporting, then the officer's not necessarily going to know what to do either. And then once you get to the hospital, if that's where you end up, then the reporting, if there's not some type of a consistent way to record what's happened, we also lose the ability to see some kind of consistent coding of what's happened there. So in this respect, it should be the responsibility of the companies to navigate the aftermath of a crash and not, lay that on the shoulders of the victims who already have, more important things to worry about in the event of the crash. Okay. Now we have a list. Robots are still an emerging technology within warehouses and industrial situations, but we also have some lessons that we can learn from those precedents as well. So in warehouses, they're generally referred to as automated guided vehicles, or AGVs. Now the differences, this slide here kind of lays out some of the differences you see from one of these environments to another. So in a warehouse environment, it's semi-structured, which means you can set up rules, you can set up constraints, you can restrict the robots to certain areas and have certain behaviors. You also have personnel that you can train in advance to let them know, how these devices are going to behave, what to do in an emergency, and so on. There's also a couple of established standards, both by ANSI and ISO, that provide some kind of regulations or some kind of design guidelines for the robots. Much of this is not true for sidewalks. So of course, sidewalks are unstructured environments. We have the general public who, are probably not getting an education on how to deal with these. And for the time being, there are no safety standards in place for how these are going to be designed. So more or less, they need to. It comes down to the responsibility of the company themselves to decide how safe these are going to be within, the confines of state requirements. Some examples of some of the things that you see in industrial locations and safety features. So what you see in both environments is that there's certain boundaries, like virtual boundaries around these robots. So when there's nobody around, they can go at a certain speed, they can operate with fewer restrictions. But once they get to a certain proximity to a human being where they need to behave a little bit more safely, then they slow down. So there's the fast speed when nobody's around, there's a slower speed when there are people around. But something that does show up in the guidelines for industrial robots is what happens in the event of an actual collision. So sensors fail, they degrade, they get dirty. Machine learning algorithms can certainly fail, and that's what leads to certain collisions. So for an industrial robot, you have things like pullback bars, pushback buttons. They have bumpers built into them, so if they actually collide with something, they stop and move back. Those requirements don't exist for the time being within state legislation for these other robots, and without safety standards, there are no guidelines for those types of designs either. One of the things that has happened in industrial locations is something that's referred to there as a pinch, and say the hydraulic brakes on one of these larger robots fails. So there's a 5-foot tall, 1,000-pound robot. The brakes fail. There's also a failure in the vision system, and somebody gets pinned against the wall. Without bumpers, without pushback buttons or pullback bars, there may not be an easy way to move that device away. So those are some of the different types of safety things that you could implement if you're following some of the standards of warehouse robots. The other thing that you see in these industrial locations that we don't seem to be seeing right now is some kind of intent display. So something that's on the outside of the robot that tells the public what it's doing. So some kind of, essentially the robotic equivalent of body language, where it's telling the people around them what it's going to be doing next. One lesson that we have from automated vehicles on this one is that if we do have those displays, they have to be consistent among different robots. So regardless of the brand, if you're going to be communicating with pedestrians to say what you're doing, you don't want to be doing a different communication language from one to the next. You don't want the pedestrians to have to learn how to work with, robotic company A versus robotic company C to figure out exactly what the robot means, or how it's telling you it's going to turn left, or it's going to turn right, or that it's going to speed up. So if there's going to be intent displays on these, they should be consistent among the various companies. Okay. So it is complicated. There's a number of different things that certainly should be considered, just to emphasize, the fact that people should be talking, that legislators should be talking to other stakeholders besides the technology companies to get a good understanding of some of the issues that might be raised in their communities. This is the closing statement from a that was brought up by a state legislator on the floor when the bill was actually being introduced, where this individual said that it's a shame to have to bring all these things before the legislature before they can even start testing. So the idea here being, why do we even need to talk about this? We should just allow them on the road. Well, there's some very good compelling reasons of why they need to be discussed first, just to make sure that your community is ready for these things to be deployed. I mean, I completely understand, wanting to get these on the road, and the pro-robot arguments are extremely compelling. By reducing the number of delivery drivers on the road and moving those to the sidewalks, you might actually improve safety on the road. But there are still these very important lessons from other industries and from within the communities that policymakers shouldn't lose sight of when they're actually having these conversations. Going back again, it's things like the crash response and reporting that I mentioned, the safe designs, and then the consistency among brands. And then certainly, of course, equitable deployment for people with disabilities and for different community concerns. But again, so it's very important to talk to outside experts and to talk to communities before they get released. Otherwise, you end up having what happened when they showed up in New York. When FedEx was doing some demonstrations, and Mayor de Blasio saw them on the road, he said, we don't want these here, get them back out again. So definitely it makes sense to have those conversations in advance, just to make sure that you don't lose the ability to have the deployments and to get all the benefits that these devices could actually bring to local communities. So not to end on a negative note on that one, certainly there are some states that have been a bit more innovative and have come up with some interesting solutions on their own. And I love this headline. This made the rounds earlier this year about Pennsylvania actually saying that delivery robots are equivalent to pedestrians. That was kind of like a soundbite that was taken out of the legislation, because there was a lot of things that Pennsylvania definitely did right when they put their legislation together. And I do want to highlight a few things that were definitely interesting and a bit more innovative by some of these states. So, for example, going back to Pennsylvania actually granted new powers to the Department of Transportation to give them authority over the operation of personal delivery devices. Also want to mention that, so I harped a couple times about the need to have crash reporting. Both Pennsylvania and Washington do require self-reporting of crashes by the companies themselves, either 24 hours or 48 hours following a crash. So there is a requirement for 2 states for that crash reporting that I was mentioning. Washington also requires pre-registration. Rhode Island would also require pre-registration through the DMV for these devices. Kansas is the only state that requires to have audio warnings specifically for people with vision impairments. And definitely off the beaten path, Oregon is the only state, to the best of my knowledge, rather than just make them legal and deploy them on the roads, Oregon created a task force to have these conversations that I was mentioning throughout my presentation. So Oregon is kind of having a wait and see approach before they actually do a deployment. Okay. So in conclusion, the takeaways and recommendations for these deployments. Some of the things that certainly if these are coming to your town, you're in a position to have these conversations in advance. Probably the best way to ensure a safe deployment and the long-term use of these is to develop common interaction standards among the different robots that are going to be on the road, to engage and work with local communities to make sure that the deployment is safe, and to find out what their specific concerns are, and just make sure that people with disabilities are included in those conversations. And then also to require the owners of the vehicles to report crashes in the rare event that they may actually occur. All right, and so I will also mention that if you're interested in looking at our information brief, it is available on the PBIC website. You can see the link there is below. You can either go to that link or you can search PBIC resources, but now you can also see that there is a link in the chat for anyone who wants to download that. And along with the information brief, there's also the legislative trackers. They're available for you all to browse and to get any information from current bills and laws that are on the books now, if you're interested. So on that note, that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Clamann, and also thank you to our audience. We've gotten a ton of questions already, but also a reminder that we do have until 3, so if you have any questions, just submit them through the question function. So I'll start off with a question about the infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure changes might be needed to enable a shared sidewalk with PDDs and to facilitate the package handoff?
Yeah, so there are a number of people who are kind of excited about PDDs and infrastructure changes because the best case scenario is that we'd have wider sidewalks that could accommodate both pedestrians, other sidewalk users, and the PDDs. And so that's one of those changes that actually benefits everybody. So more sidewalk space for the robots also means more sidewalk space for the users. Now, that again, that's a best case scenario. That is not as likely. So for the time being, the robots that are being tested, it's being done with the current infrastructure. So I think the idea is that there wouldn't necessarily need to be any changes for these things to operate. So it's kind of like, what is the minimum requirement versus what is best case? One of the things that does come up is if sidewalks, I know this is true in the town where I live, if they're damaged, it can definitely throw off some of the sensors. So if you're imagining something that's using a camera to navigate like immediately in front of the robot, if it hits a pothole or some kind of a bump, it's going to make that camera go in a completely different direction and potentially throw off the navigation. So again, you're going to want to be working with a fairly with a sidewalk that's not in need of repair for these things to work. So again, so you've got this gamut, I guess, from what is possible versus what is ideal.
Makes sense. So then we have some questions about what happens when the delivery robots are done making deliveries, as in where do they dwell, and how do they avoid blocking sidewalks when they're not traveling?
Yeah, so that's two questions. So these are all going to be, they're all battery operated, and so they're all going to need to be recharged. So there is going to be some kind of a central charging station for them to return to. The answer, unfortunately, depends on what type of robot they're doing. So some of them, for example, the Digit. The idea behind that one is that they would actually be deployed from a truck that releases them into a neighborhood, and then they would come, once they were done delivering, they would return to the truck. But with others, they might return to some kind of a central charging station before they can go back out again. But yeah, there have been some pictures that have circulated the internet that you can see on Twitter of large groups of these all kind of waiting in the same place. So there's really nothing that stops it from happening. Again, that's one of the things that's kind of in the hands of the company to decide how they're going to handle that situation.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of timelines, so we saw a lot of hype back in 2019 when a lot of these companies were kind of putting out their first models. What would you say is the timeline for their more general deployment?
Yeah, so some of them are deployed now. Really, probably one of the most common places that you're going to see these deployed right now is going to be on college campuses. So there's a number of different campuses where you can get these deliveries. I know in Virginia and in Texas, in Arizona, you're seeing them actually being used right now. But again, all of these have to be closely monitored by a human being. And so until they can find ways to make them behave more autonomously, they're limited by the internal staff that's able to watch them. So I couldn't tell you exactly what the deployment is. I'm sure that the companies are eager to get them out and being used as soon as possible. But in some respects, you could say that in some limited deployments, they're out there right now and available to make deliveries.
That's great. And then we have a few questions coming in about AI. So the first one is, how does these PDDs account for Black or darker skin? because we know that a lot of them have had problems with that as compared to people with whiter, lighter skin. So what's your sense of how these PDDs have progressed in that aspect?
Yeah, so that's going to be one of those things that that are going to be based on what the individual companies, how they've decided to handle that situation. I side with whoever was asking that question, because I have the exact same concern, because there have been issues with a number of different technologies having those same types of issues, which is why it's important for them to be tested in the environments where they're actually going to be deployed. Again, I think what we're seeing right now is, for the most part, they're being monitored very closely for safety by the staff of these different companies. And so they're teaching these AI algorithms to operate independently over time. But again, it would be each one of these companies certainly wants to be the first to deploy and wants to have the largest impact on the deployment. But yeah, I couldn't tell you which one is actually, having that particular progress with AI. Just for me, again, I agree, and hopefully they're actually testing in the communities where they're going to be deploying.
And then building off AI again, what kind of metrics can be imposed to encourage the continuous improvement of these AI systems?
I would say reporting and tracking from an objective third party. So if it's left, I mean, certainly these technology companies have very, highly qualified developers who are building these technologies. But certainly if you want to see those improvements, again, relative to the communities where they're being deployed, that has to be done, that has to be established by a third party. And again, it's one of the challenges, and we see the same thing with automated vehicles. Like if you test, in Tempe, Arizona, and then you actually use that knowledge to deploy in, say, Philadelphia, you could get very different results because you may get very, very different behaviors. And again, we've seen this with automated vehicles already, that the way that people interact on sidewalks in one town is not necessarily going to be the same as you see in the other. So what you're seeing right now is a lot of more controlled situations. So college campuses that have wide sidewalks or good greenway paths to walk on. So it's a little bit more simple environment. But yeah, I mean, I think it's going to take some time before these are deployed, because again, it has to do with you need to test them in more environments. You need to add the training data for those AI algorithms in as many different places as possible. But then also you need to be able to do that outside of the context of the person who's actually controlling the vehicle. Like you need to give them a chance to work on their own. So again, these things are just going to take time, and it really just depends on where they're deployed.
Yeah. So as you showed in your chart, there are a lot of states that don't have a lot of regulations on this. Mm-hmm. So with a lot of states not taking action to limit this, what do you think is the best course of action to kind of enforce these PDDs when the state hasn't?
Yeah, no, I think what the state should do is, whoever the most appropriate body is, whether it's the Department of Motor Vehicles or the DOT or the municipality or something like that, someone has to have authority over when these things can actually be stopped within a particular community. So the local municipality should have the power, like if they decide that a particular brand isn't safe, they should be allowed to make them stop operating in a particular area. But then also, if the companies want to operate in a particular area, then the responsibility should come on them for actually reporting if there's going to be a crash, because they're going to have access to all the information. So all of these things, they have cameras for navigation. They have the ability to record when there's one of these interactions, and so they have the ability to come up with a detailed assessment of a crash. So there should be some kind of crash reporting criteria in the event of a crash. The company should be required within a particular time period to actually submit a report to some entity that's providing oversight, and then those reports then get stored in some central database that's available to the public. So there has to be, the logging of the reports, but then also the transparency. That would be my recommendation for that. Great.
And then for the implementation, do you think the biggest barriers are the technology itself or the public policy surrounding it?
It's a great question. I would say at this point, because in most cases, the public policy in place would allow the technology to go out there. So I would say that in most cases right now, given the flexibility or the openness of the legislation in most states, I would say it's the technology that's holding things back right now. Which again, credit goes to the technology companies for deploying in stages to ensure safety of the public.
Then how would the regulations depend on the type of city or the specific built environment?
Yeah, so basically an urban environment, versus a rural environment, there are you may have certain sidewalk infrastructure, you might have more congestion in some areas versus others. Like there might be some places where you might not want these to move. So if they're if you're walking in a crowd of people, you're not necessarily looking, down to make sure that you're not stepping on a robot that's moving at the same speed that you are. So I would say in particularly dense environments, the particular area might want to decide whether or not they want it to be present. So if you have a place though with a wider sidewalk or fewer pedestrians, then you might have different types of restrictions. So I would say population density. Also, one of the other things that comes up, I didn't talk about this in the talk, but other people have covered it, is the more deployments you have, there's competition now on the sidewalk. So say you have, the autonomous kiosk that pulls up to the curb. You've got FedEx that's making a delivery at the same time that Amazon is dropping off its 24-hour package, and someone is getting a takeout order. Now you're starting to see some sidewalk congestion, and at that point, there has to be some kind of procedure in place for determining who gets priority and in what type of order that these things start arriving to a particular doorstep in. So that's something that we're going to have to decide in advance also, so we don't end up tripping over these things as they start queuing up to the same locations. But yeah, those are some of the other thing that are certainly going to be challenges is at some point these things need to cross streets. And because they don't have fingers, they can't push the walk button. So there may also have to be ways that the different areas decide whether or not they can cross the street or against a light, or if they're just going to have to go a little bit further on down the road before they start crossing on a crosswalk.
Great. And then do you believe these PDDs or these PDD operating companies should be licensed? How do you feel about licensure?
Yeah, I know it's not a popular opinion, but I do think that they should be licensed. I think that there needs to be some kind of a record of who is operating in a particular area, just to prevent someone, say, if I wanted to, create my own robot and, deploy the Clamann robot in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, maybe there should be something preventing me from doing that. Where, again, all these companies, they have great experience. There's definitely attention to safety, but what about the smaller companies that might not, have put as much time into it? So yeah, I think it's important that there's some kind of minimum standards on deploying in a community, which can be ensured through licensure. Which, yeah, again, I know and I understand the counter argument. That delays deployment. It creates barriers to deploying the technology. But yeah, I think that's one of the safeguards that really is needed.
And we have a few questions coming in about labor. Do you think there are any labor concerns with these devices taking away jobs, or is there really a critical need for this delivery niche?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and that has come up in a number of different environments when it comes to any type of automated system or any type of automated vehicle, that there is going to be some kind of a trade-off. So there's a couple of ways to look at it. I mean, so first, yes, you would expect to a certain level that some jobs would be displaced. But what you tend to see within automation is that while you might be replacing some types of jobs, you're actually creating a number of others in a different area. So you will still need, even if there's no delivery, if you're replacing a delivery driver, there's still a need to monitor these devices, even if they're, if they're deploying somewhat autonomously, there still have to be human monitors within their dispatch centers that are watching over them. Somebody still has to physically put the delivery into the robot. for it to go off somewhere. So there's usually a trade-off of the types of jobs that we're going to be seeing. We saw in part a lot of extra activity last year from these devices that may have been due to the pandemic. So at least that is, one of the things that was being noted in the press was that for people who are less comfortable with somebody who's more comfortable with so-called contactless delivery, this actually gives you the ability to make deliveries, say, with medications or to people who are more highly at risk to an infectious disease. They might be better served by some of these robots. So there is also the possibility of opening up new types of distribution rather than just replacing what we already have. But I think that those decisions are still being made. I think the companies are still trying to figure out exactly what it is that's trying to be filled here by the robots delivering to different wares.
Yeah. We have a lot of questions coming in about ADA violations and things of that nature. So has there been any pushback from, say, the Access Board about the use of PDDs? And in the instances where the PDDs are already out, has there been any issues with interacting with disabled individuals?
Yeah, there have been a couple of examples of, and these are cited in the information brief that we have, in particular of encounters with someone in a wheelchair. There was also an encounter with somebody who was both vision and sight impaired, and the person delivery device interacting with her dog. So yeah, I mean, there have been some. To the best of my knowledge, no one has been hurt, but there definitely some of those events have actually kind of raised the profile of what happens when these devices are encountered by people with disabilities. Again, I can't speak for what's happening in every single community. I know in some locations, people with disabilities have been included in conversations. I know in others, they definitely haven't, which is a bit unfortunate. I'm hoping that, the more states, become involved and the more conversations and more people learn about these devices, the more these can take place, which is why one of the recommendations I have to both, state legislators and to these various companies is just make sure you're engaging with those populations in the actual community so you can understand exactly what's going on there. So, but yeah, as far as knowing exactly who's been included in these conversations, I don't know, but I do know of multiple examples where they were not consulted, unfortunately.
So then you spoke about the lower speed robots on the sidewalks and then kind of the higher speed, mid-speed ones on like the bike lanes inside of the road. Do you think one or the other is a better option to avoid congestion and safety risks, or do they fill two different niches?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think they fill two different niches. I mean, as a person who does some bike commuting, I'm a little bit wary of either being chased by one of these or having them appear in the bike lane in front of me. I mean, I encounter people on the shoulder all the time, and I'm used to passing and being passed by different people. But no, again, I think this depends really on the community and what's there. I could imagine a place that has a good bicycling infrastructure, something like the Rev 1 would work a little bit better. But I think that really the question in this is there's not an easy answer, and the question is what happens when these things get deployed at scale, and what is the limit to the number of these devices that can appear on the sidewalk. And there's a difference between when there's one appearing on your city block versus when there's 5. And so I think that's really where the question is. It comes down to sidewalk management and just making sure that we can still handle whatever the volume of deployments are on the sidewalk or near the sidewalk.
Yeah, that's great. You kind of touched on this when you spoke about the ADA interaction, but are there any best practices for communities or municipalities on engaging with their citizens to determine how PDDs should be deployed?
Yeah, I think really this depends on talking to the community. I couldn't tell you about best practices because I'm not personally, a member of any of those organizations. Like for myself, when I have questions about automated vehicles or these devices, I reach out to those different interest groups myself. So yeah, I don't know about best practices. I would just recommend for the particular community, find where those people are and go ahead and reach out to them yourself and find out what the unique circumstances are for that particular deployment community.
Great. And then what are some ideal sectors that could use PDD, and what are some regulations that could target these specific sectors?
Yeah, well, I think that's more of like a business question, not so much, you know, the interaction question that I know a bit more on. Honestly, I think if I were qualified to run businesses like that, I may not be in research. So I'm not really sure what the best market niche is for these. I think that's still being explored. Again, I personally like the idea of using these devices for the deployment of medications for those at-risk populations, and getting things to people in more of like emergency type deliveries and things like that. But again, I think more time will tell, you know, what people actually want from these things. I think that we still don't really know exactly, you know, what the best model is. But again, that is said with the, you know, full disclosure, that is not my area of expertise, and I'm sure there's a number of other, you know, business consultants who can give you a better answer than I could on that.
Great. Well, I think I'll close it up with that. So, do you have any other last thoughts, Dr. Clamann?
I don't. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk about our research. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks everyone for coming to this webinar. You can find the slides and a recording on our website, enotrends.org, and also a recording will be emailed to all the registrants within a day. Again, Eno is happy to offer our webinar series free of charge, and if you do enjoy them and you're interested in supporting our work, you can check the link in the chat box to donate or become a member. So again, thank you, Dr. Clamann, and thank you to our audience for your participation, and make sure to sign up for our next webinar, Guiding the New UAS Industry to Safety Excellence, which is on September 8th. Have a good afternoon.